Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into the night air of ancient Korea, where copper bowls quietly drip, roosters don't sleep in, and palace engineers obsess over something you might take for granted: telling time. You're standing in the cold marble courtyard of a royal palace. The moon hovers like a pale eye above you, and the silence is interrupted only by the slow plink, plink of water falling into a basin. A rooster, made entirely of bronze, standing stiff and elegant, sits on a wooden platform beside it. You'd expect a squawk. Instead, you get a mechanical click. The rooster's head jerks up and its beak opens slightly. "Time to wake up," it says without saying anything. But you're not ready. Trust me, you probably won't survive this time-obsessed kingdom without at least a nap and some historical orientation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're watching from. Let's compare our modern clocks to these ancient ones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle deeper into the palace. Every corridor glows with candlelight. Murals cover the walls, paintings of kings, constellations, dragons, and celestial clocks. But you're not just here to look at art. You're going to follow the sound of dripping water, straight into the ticking heart of a civilization that turned time into something sacred. See, ancient Korea didn't always have water clocks or crowing statues. Back in the really early days, people relied on nature. The rooster crows at dawn? Great. Shadows move across the ground? Even better. But there was a big problem. Sometimes the rooster had a sore throat. Sometimes clouds covered the sun. And in a kingdom where kings timed battles, monks timed prayers, and farmers timed harvests, vibes-based timekeeping wasn't going to cut it. So what do you do when the sun's hiding and the rooster's on strike? You get clever. You put time in a bowl. The first Korean clepsydras, yes, that's the fancy word for water clocks, were almost laughably simple. A bronze bowl with a tiny hole in the bottom floating in another bowl. As water dripped from one into the other, the bowl would eventually sink. When it did, ta-da, a rough unit of time had passed. Historians still argue whether this method was imported from China or invented independently in Korea, but either way, it caught on like wildfire. After all, the water didn't oversleep. I didn't get sick. It didn't argue with shamans. You find one of these early bowls tucked inside a wooden cabinet. It's not very dramatic, kind of like a glorified soup dish. But kneel down, watch closely. Water flows in, slow as a whisper. Every drop lands with a delicate ting. It's almost meditative. One drop, one moment. It's not just a measure, it's a rhythm. Now, for a bit of quirky trivia, the Koreans sometimes added dye to the water. Why? Because clear water's hard to see in a bronze bowl, so they'd use charcoal or even flower pigments. Imagine setting your day by red water flowing into a golden dish, functional and aesthetic. Of course, a single bowl was fine for monks doing early prayers or farmers pacing their planting. But in the royal court, you needed a little more drama. If a king says, "I want dinner at the 6th hour," he doesn't want somewhere between now and when the rooster feels like it. He wants precision. That's when the gears start turning, literally. One of the earliest breakthroughs came when engineers started adding graduated marks inside the bowls. Instead of waiting for it to sink, you just check which mark the water's reached. That was great, but reading tiny lines on a bowl in candlelight, not ideal. So, how about some bells? Suddenly, you're inside a chamber near the palace's astronomy observatory. It's surprisingly humid in here. Turns out water clocks require a lot of maintenance. You spot a tall contraption made of wood, bronze, and paper. At the base, a reservoir feeding into a pipe. At the end of the pipe, a spoon slowly filling with water. Once full, it tips, plink, into a bucket. That triggers a small seesaw, which drops a ball down a track. The ball hits a bell. The bell rings. A small wooden man pops out of a door with a scroll that says "Third Hour." You stand back. Your phone buzzes in your pocket with a notification, and somehow it feels less magical. Now, before we go any deeper, you should know, the Rooster isn't just for decoration. Some of these mechanical clocks, especially during the Goryeo and Joseon periods, featured automaton roosters. These weren't just stationary statues. They flapped their wings. They moved their beaks. They sometimes even released sound, either mechanically or with help from hidden musicians who played a pre-timed crow using wind instruments. Historians still argue whether these roosters were purely mechanical or assisted by servants behind the scenes. After all, some royal records vaguely mention attendants aiding the sound. But let's be honest, whether it's a robot chicken or a guy with a flute, it's still cooler than your smartphone alarm. Here's another fun little oddity. The clocks were often shaped like animals. Dragons, turtles, even phoenixes. Each creature had a symbolic role. Dragons for power, turtles for longevity, roosters for punctuality. Yes, in a world without iPhones, the rooster was your best hope for catching the bus. But here's where it gets weirder. In some regions, particularly during early Joseon, water clocks weren't just tools, they were sacred. There were court rituals where the head timekeeper, yes, that was a job, would offer incense before adjusting the clock. Because time wasn't just hours and minutes, it was cosmic harmony. Getting it wrong was like throwing off the balance of heaven and earth. No pressure, right? You peek through a silk curtain and spot one of these ceremonies happening in miniature. A scholar kneels before the clock, murmurs something under his breath, and gently tweaks the water flow. A bead of sweat rolls down his neck. It's just water, but it's also everything. Now imagine being that guy, knowing that if the clock is off by even 10 minutes, the king might start a military parade too early, or delay a harvest blessing, or worse, get indigestion from lunch arriving at the wrong time. Want one more reason to respect these clocks? They had to be maintained constantly. The water had to be the right temperature, yes, cold water flows slower. The air had to be still. Too much wind? Clock malfunctions. Too little humidity? Water evaporates too fast. Rainy season? Good luck. There's a reason modern museums often recreate these clocks, but rarely run them. As you back away from the echoing chamber, your ears still ringing faintly from the last bell, you pass a set of tiles covered in names. These are the engineers, mathematicians, and artisans who built the original devices. Most of them are forgotten to history, but their legacy? Still ticking. And just when you think this palace couldn't get more obsessed with time, you turn a corner and find a hallway painted from floor to ceiling with moon phases, zodiac animals, and diagrams of eclipses. Why? Because in ancient Korea, astronomy and timekeeping were one and the same. The stars didn't just guide ships, they scheduled royal ceremonies. The moon's shadow wasn't just pretty, it told you when to light the fire signal towers. So no, this isn't just about a clock, it's about order, power, spirituality, and yes, maybe just a touch of perfectionism. You feel a chill creep up your spine. Somewhere above you, the mechanical rooster prepares to crow again, and you wonder, When's the last time you really noticed what time it was? You shuffle deeper into the palace corridors, past shelves lined with ink scrolls and brass instruments, until the scent of pine ink and melting beeswax gives way to something older. You're not in Sejong's era yet. You've gone back even further, to when Goryeo kings ruled the land and time was less a precise measurement and more a chaotic gamble. The night feels heavier here. Time doesn't click like it did back there with the rooster statues and water bowls. Instead, it drips slowly, unevenly, like rain finding its own path down a mountainside. And you're about to witness the kingdom's first desperate flirtation with the concept of order. In the Goryeo dynasty, think 10th to 14th century CE, the idea of tracking time wasn't entirely new, but enforcing it across a kingdom filled with peasants, monks, merchants, and ever-bickering nobles, that was like trying to schedule a Zoom call with 80,000 people during a thunderstorm. Still, the royal court craved structure. Why? Because structure meant power. If you, the king, could say, "At precisely the 5th hour, my armies shall march," and then actually have those armies march at that very 5th hour, you weren't just a man anymore, you were something divine. In ancient Korea, timing wasn't just punctuality, it was heavenly alignment, harmony between ruler and universe. And if the rooster happened to oversleep, that harmony collapsed like an undercooked rice cake. Unfortunately, harmony doesn't come easy when your entire timing system depends on the moods of the sun, the moon, and one tragically unpredictable bird. Let's talk about roosters. Yes, roosters crow at dawn. Sometimes, unless they don't feel like it, or unless it's overcast, or unless, as one court document from the Goryeo era half-jokingly notes, the rooster partakes in fermented rice and grows confused. Historians still debate whether that was a metaphor, an insult, or a very drunk chicken. Whatever the case, relying on roosters for national coordination was never a long-term strategy. That didn't stop people from trying, though. In village squares, for instance, it was common to place rooster statues, made of wood or clay, near the public bell. They weren't functional, just symbolic. The idea was, the rooster crows, we ring the bell, the village wakes. That works great until, say, the real rooster dies, or the bell ringer decides to sleep in. Cue temporal chaos. It was during these frustrations that the royal court began turning its gaze toward foreign lands, especially China. At the time, Chinese dynasties were already experimenting with more sophisticated timekeeping. Gears, drips, even mechanical puppets. Korea imported several of these ideas, but here's the twist. They didn't just copy them, they improved them. Quietly, steadily, out of pure necessity. See, the Goryeo kings weren't like the later Joseon rulers who had King Sejong and his scientific dream team. Goryeo's rulers were more like anxious bosses who kept yelling, "Just fix it," without giving their engineers enough budget or sleep. So the inventors had to get scrappy. They started with sundials, which, yes, are exactly what they sound like. You stick a rod in the ground and watch the shadow move. But this only works if the sun's out, which in Korea's misty mountain climate isn't a given. So then came the simplest water clocks. Bronze vessels with small holes. The problem? These were boring. No one heard them work. There was no ticking, no bell, no visual cue, just dripping. That's when the Goryeo court got an idea both brilliant and a little unhinged. Combine the rooster's drama with the water clock's reliability. Create something new, something symbolic and functional. Something that squawked on cue but didn't eat bugs or wander off. They started experimenting with mechanical roosters. The earliest attempts were primitive, wind-up toys made of paper and wood, with joints that moved when water tipped a small lever. One record mentions a wooden cock that flapped its wings every 8th mark. Another describes a bronze rooster mounted on a floating plank that rose and sank with the water level. And every time the water reached a certain line, the rooster's head bobbed up. Were they effective? Meh. Were they majestic? Absolutely not. One observer wrote, "The cock sputtered like a drowning fish." Harsh, but we respect the attempt. These were the baby steps toward greatness, because behind the creaking gears and splintering rooster beaks, something else was happening. Timing culture was being born. You begin to notice how the entire palace starts behaving differently around time. There's a rhythm to it now. Morning incense ceremonies start not around sunrise, but at the second shadow length, which sounds poetic until you realize it's a standardized measurement. Candle clocks are introduced, sticks of wax with lines drawn on them. Burn it to line 3, that's an hour. Burn it to line 5. Dinner's late. Burn it all the way. Somebody's getting fired. Candle clocks even come scented. Yes, scented. One royal record tells of a wax timing stick that released different perfumes every hour. Imagine a mix of cinnamon, pine, and lotus wafting through a palace corridor to tell people it's lunchtime. Honestly, that's more pleasant than your iPhone's alarm tone. Historians still argue whether these scented candles were widespread or a rich person-only indulgence, but the concept stuck. Time now had flavor. It had a scent. It was felt in the body, not just counted. Yet, even with all these tools, Goryeo wasn't quite satisfied. They wanted something bigger, something that didn't require perfect sunlight, still air, or roosters that behaved. What they wanted was the beginning of automatic timekeeping, and that meant water, gears, and human-sized ambition. You descend a short flight of stairs into an underground room. It's damp, smells faintly of copper and mildew. And there it is, a half-collapsed mechanism, reconstructed in drawings and memory. This was the early prototype of what would one day become the full-scale water clock. A set of interlinked vessels. One fills slowly with water, triggering a lever. That lever moves a rod, which pushes a counterweight. The counterweight drops, releasing a bell. Every movement triggers another, like dominoes soaked in humidity. And perched at the end? You guessed it, a rooster. This one doesn't crow, it just opens its wings as if it's about to. But that gesture alone was enough. It meant an hour has passed. You may now panic accordingly. You squint at the carvings surrounding the device. They show scholars in robes, bows raised, saluting the clock. Not because it was beautiful, it wasn't, but because it finally let them control what had always controlled them. For centuries, time had been slippery, tied to weather, mood, rooster morale. But now it dripped predictably. It struck bells. It obeyed. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Rain messed everything up. A flood in the records room once caused a panic when the clock drifted 2 hours off schedule. A rooster statue cracked and fell sideways, leading an entire village to think it was still midnight. One overly ambitious engineer tried to add a second rooster, double crowing for emphasis, and instead triggered a mechanical fight between both birds that made court ladies scream. Still, the obsession grew, and with it came a new job title, Sigwan Sang, literally, time official. These people were charged with watching the clocks, adjusting the flows, measuring the days. It was a deeply respected and deeply stressful post. And here's where the final twist of this chapter arrives. As the Goryeo dynasty began to fade and the Joseon era loomed on the horizon, something strange happened. People began to believe that controlling time meant controlling destiny. Astrologers and clockmakers started working together, not just to mark the hours, but to predict them. If the water clock hit the 7th mark during a solar eclipse, was that a good omen? Should we delay the king's journey? Should the rooster be allowed to flap, or should it rest? Timekeeping became superstitious. The boundary between science and mysticism blurred like steam over the palace pond. And so, as you exit this chamber, your ears full of imaginary crowing and your brain swimming in ancient anxiety, you realize something odd. For a civilization still decades away from true automation, Goryeo Korea was already living in a mechanized mindset. Every drop, every wing flap, every scented hour, it all pointed to a culture determined to trap time in a box, even if the box leaked. And next time, you're going to meet the man who finally made it work. A sleepy-eyed genius who stared at dripping bowls until they sang. But that's a story for when the rooster crows again. You wake to the sound of something trickling, soft, steady, almost meditative. Except it's not water from a leaky roof or a babbling brook. No, this sound is too calculated, too rhythmic. Like each drop has somewhere to be, a purpose to fulfill. And it does. You're in the early Joseon dynasty now, and the man responsible for this watery symphony is none other than Jang Yong-sil, the sleep-deprived inventor who turned Korea's timing dreams into mechanical poetry. Imagine a man so brilliant that a king broke centuries of caste tradition just to bring him into court. You're standing right beside that man as he squints into a bronze basin, brush in one hand, a caliper in the other, and at least 2 unpaid interns trailing behind him, carrying blueprints that no one but him fully understands. But let's rewind a second. Unique context. It's the early 15th century. Joseon is young, feisty, and trying to prove it's more than just Goryeo 2.0. King Sejong the Great has recently taken the throne. He's not just royalty, he's a full-on polymath, obsessed with science, governance, and giving his people something better than guess the hour based on Rooster vibes. The thing is, he needs help. Not just bureaucrats or generals, he needs nerds. Talented, obsessive, socially awkward people who lose sleep over whether a water drip can trigger a drum beat. People like Jang Yong-sil. Now, Jang wasn't born with a silver spoon. He came from a lower class, probably a guano, technician-slave background. In Joseon's rigid society, this should have disqualified him from doing anything beyond fixing carts or sweeping palace paths. But King Sejong saw him tinkering with an old Chinese astronomical device, realized the man had unholy levels of skill, and personally ordered him to be promoted. Cue outrage from the nobles. You're putting that guy in charge of royal science? Yes. Yes, he was. And thank goodness he did. Jang's first task: build a timekeeping device that didn't rely on sunlight, clouds, or feathered mood swings. A machine that would work indoors, year-round, and ideally wouldn't explode. Enter the Jagyokru, Korea's first self-striking water clock. Let's break it down for a second. The word Jagyokru translates roughly to automatic striking water clock. And oh boy, was it a mouthful in both name and design. Picture this. A giant ceramic or bronze container slowly fills with water. As it fills, the weight causes a float, think of a wooden bowl, inside to rise. That float pulls a string which activates a lever, which releases a steel ball. That ball rolls down a wooden track and hits a small gong. Ting. 1 hour has passed. Not impressed yet? Fine. Imagine that after the gong rings, a puppet soldier steps out from a tiny door and raises a placard showing the time. A mechanical puppet in 1434, made with hand-forged gears and nothing resembling electricity. Still not enough? What if I told you the entire system reset itself after each cycle, ready to ring again without human help? Now you're paying attention. Historians still argue whether Zhang Yongsil invented every single mechanism in the clock or adapted existing Chinese principles with his own improvements. What's certain is this: no one had built a self-striking water clock quite like this in East Asia before. You peek over Zhang's shoulder as he gestures to a sketch. It's filled with looping red lines, pulley diagrams, and notes like, "Make Rooster stop flapping during a royal nap hour." He's tired. His robes are stained with soot and ink. But when that first bell chimes cleanly on cue, the look on his face is pure, unfiltered glee. The palace cheers. Even Sejong claps softly from behind his study screen. The Rooster statues? They can take a nap. This clock is a game changer. It doesn't just keep time, it announces it loudly, clearly, predictably. People can now schedule meetings, ceremonies, even military drills based on something other than when the sun hits the third pillar. For the first time in Korean history, time behaves, and here's where things start to scale. Because now that Sejong has one of these clocks in his royal complex, he wants more. Many versions are commissioned for provincial offices. Monks request simplified versions for temple use. Merchants in the capital city even start using basic timing bowls to coordinate deliveries. Time is no longer confined to the elite. It's spreading like morning fog across the rice paddies. Zhang doesn't stop at the Jagyokru. Encouraged by the king, he designs multiple models. One version includes 12 mechanical monks who strike drums in turn, each wearing symbolic robes for different zodiac animals. Another version includes tiny celestial orbs that spin in time with the heavens, a nod to Korea's strong astrological culture. Of course, nothing this complex comes without issues. Sometimes the floats get stuck. Sometimes the water freezes in winter. One infamous event occurred when a court prankster added fish to the clock basin, thinking it would be cute. Spoiler, it wasn't. The fish clogged the drainage hole and delayed time by 3 hours. Still, Zhang Yongsil adapts. He adds copper filters, adjustable valves, even a simple warning chime that sounds 10 minutes before the actual hour, a sort of ancient snooze alarm. But not everyone is thrilled. Remember the aristocrats? They're still salty. In fact, a faction of them begins accusing Zhang of hubris, saying that man cannot master the heavens, that his clocks are arrogant, that by controlling time he's usurping the cosmic order. There's even a movement, half political, half religious, to return to more natural timekeeping. Sundials, roosters, burning incense. The argument? If the ancients trusted nature, why shouldn't we? Historians still argue whether this backlash was rooted in genuine philosophy or just jealousy wrapped in Confucian robes. Either way, it sets the stage for Zhang's fall. One day, he's summoned to oversee a royal carriage project. Nothing to do with clocks. Something goes wrong. The carriage breaks under the king's weight, and though Zhang wasn't directly responsible, the court uses it as an excuse. He's stripped of his title, quietly exiled. Just like that, Korea's greatest inventor vanishes from the records. No one knows where he died, no one knows how. You linger in his workshop after he's gone. His tools are still laid out, blueprints still pinned to the walls. A float still bobs gently in the water basin, counting down the next bell that will ring with no one there to hear it. And yet, his legacy? It rings on. Within a decade, copies of the Jagyokru spread across Joseon. Later engineers continue refining the system. Some add sound pipes so that bells chime even louder. Others experiment with mercury instead of water to prevent freezing, though those didn't end well. Mercury poisoning is a bad look for any timekeeper. Eventually, other countries take note. Korean emissaries proudly present mini water clocks as diplomatic gifts. One even ends up in the Ming court in China. Another is sent to Ryukyu, modern-day Okinawa, where it's mistaken for a weather machine and left in a temple until someone dares to wind it. And you? You lean against the wall of Zhang's empty lab, listening to the faint echo of mechanisms that outlived their maker. What started as a desperate fix for Rooster unreliability has become something else entirely. A mechanical heartbeat that pulses through Joseon's capital, temple to temple, court to cottage. Because now, when a monk begins prayer, or a general gives an order, or a farmer sets out for the market, it's all in sync. Not with birds, not with guesses, but with a clock, a Korean clock. Tick, tock, drip, bang. The rooster may still crow in the yard. But in Joseon, the water clock rules the dawn. You sit quietly now, back resting against a cool stone wall, the echoes of the water clock's last chime still humming in your ears. The mechanical rooster puppets have retreated into their little doors. The basin's gentle drip has slowed, but your eyes, they drift eastward to the common city folk, the morning vendors, the guards changing shifts. The invention Zhang Yong-sil perfected has crept into every crevice of daily life. But tonight's journey presses on, and your path now leads through Gyeongbokgung Palace during its most dazzling years. Not the kind tourists see on glossy posters, but the real, grimy, glorious engine of Joseon Korea's administration. And in its beating heart, the Office of Instruments, or Gamcheonsa, where royal scientists spend their lives doing two things, measuring things and arguing about how to measure them better. You duck into a narrow hallway lit by candle sconces. Inside, a dozen men in blue and brown handbook are hunched over scrolls. Some scribble furiously, some pace. One is asleep on a table with rice stuck to his cheek. Welcome to Korea's most advanced nerd cave. In the center of it all, resting in a glass case, is a new prototype of the water clock. This one's different. You notice it immediately. Fewer puppets, more polished wood, a vertical column instead of the usual basin shape. This, my friend, is what happens when timekeeping becomes political. The king, still Sejong, but now older, wiser, and definitely more annoyed with missed court appointments, has asked for a version of the water clock that can be monitored from afar. See, having the clock chime was nice, but what if someone wanted to see how much time had passed without needing to be near the mechanism? The answer? The Chonmin-ru, or Heavenly Civilian Clock. This design has two clever additions: a clear window showing the water level and a floating indicator rod, painted with lines and symbols corresponding to the hours. The higher the rod rises, the further along the day you are. No noise, no puppets, just a slow, silent climb through time. But this quieter approach stirs up a storm inside the Office of Instruments. One official, Scholar Nam, insists that a clock that doesn't make noise will cause people to ignore it. He waves a scroll in the air and shouts, "The chime is the virtue. Without it, time is lawless." Another scholar, Jin, calmly replies, "And yet farmers cannot hear the chime in their fields. They need clocks they can see. Historians still argue whether these debates were genuine technical concerns or just bureaucratic jostling to earn royal favor. Some even suggest the scholars were trying to outdo one another for future record-keeping fame. Meanwhile, on the streets of Hanyang, modern Seoul, the people have started creating their own timekeeping hacks. Merchants hang water bowls with marked bamboo sticks in the center. As the stick rises, they announce, "Half the stick is wet. Lunch break." It's not accurate, but it's good enough for noodle delivery timing. Fishermen on the Han River, they cut notches into wax candles and let them burn overnight. Each notch takes an hour. When the third drip of wax hits the turtle carving, one says, it's time to pull the nets. Even kids get involved. In one village, you meet a boy who's rigged a toy wheel to spin every time his mother's kitchen ladle leaks water into a funnel. When it spins 12 times, he giggles, "My dad comes home." Not quite ISO certified, but heart-meltingly practical. Back at the palace, the clockmakers don't know it yet, but their inventions are birthing a new culture of time. One that doesn't just serve royalty, but filters down to the street-side tofu vendor, the night watch guard, and yes, even the child waiting for his dad's footsteps at dusk. But here's where the story takes a twist. As more people begin relying on these devices, expectations around time itself start to change. Before, if someone said, "We'll meet in the morning," that could mean anything between sunrise and noon. Now, people ask, which hour? The 3rd? The 6th? Time is shrinking, becoming more exact, more relentless. You overhear a servant complain, "I used to nap until the rooster crowed. Now the master says I'm late if the 6th bell has rung." He sighs, sipping broth. "I miss roosters." Even the royal court feels the pressure. One high-ranking minister is rebuked for arriving after the 8th drumbeat. He tries to blame it on mud. The king deadpans, "Then tell the mud to wake you sooner." And yet, time doesn't just discipline, it empowers. Doctors now time herbal decoctions to the minute, improving results. Astronomers align their observations with known hours, charting stars with startling accuracy. Even poets begin referencing the 7th hour's hush or the 9th bell's sorrow in their verses. It's not just an invention, it's transformation. But not everyone is thrilled. Religious groups raise concerns. If time belongs to humans, what of the divine cycles? Some monks claim that mechanical time is spiritually unclean, an affront to natural harmony. They argue that hours should flow with the moon, the seasons, the breath of trees, not brass and gears. Some even retreat to mountaintop monasteries to escape what they call the tyranny of the drip. One fringe group, half philosophers, half hermits, begins designing randomized clocks that intentionally ring at inconsistent intervals, claiming this brings people closer to the true flow of the universe. Spoiler, no one uses them for scheduling. You reach the end of the hallway in the Office of Instruments. There, hidden behind a curtain, is a secret side project, not officially sanctioned, but too weird to ignore. It's a hybrid time altar. A flat stone platform surrounded by miniature water troughs. Floating wooden animals, dog, rooster, monkey, snake, all drifting slowly as water pushes them in circles. Each represents a 2-hour time block in the traditional Korean zodiac. As the animal reaches a marked point, a tiny bell rings, and a monk quietly marks the hour on a scroll. No puppets, no dramatic drums. Just spirit, water, and patience. Historians still argue whether these hybrid devices were sincere spiritual tools or simply eccentric hobby projects of clock-obsessed officials. Either way, They reveal a deeper truth. Timing in ancient Korea wasn't just about precision, it was about meaning. You sit cross-legged beside the altar, watching the rooster float its lazy way toward the top. It wobbles slightly in the water, bumping the bell with a clink. Not a roar, not a shout, just a whisper of time passing. And then you remember something. Time here isn't linear. In Western clocks, the second hand races forever forward. In Joseon timekeeping hours cycle, zodiac animals return. The day bends back to morning, again and again. There's comfort in that. You rise and look out toward the mountains. The farmers are in their fields now. A bell echoes faintly in the distance. The heavenly civilian clock must have chimed again. But no one looks up. They don't need to, because by now they feel it. The rhythm of days kept steady not just by brass and bamboo, but by hearts that have slowly learned to beat and sync with water's soft pulse. You're walking now, not through palace halls or scholar-filled offices, but down an earthen path lined with thatched rooftops, early morning steam rising from pots of rice porridge and roosters you can actually hear. The real kind, scratching at the dirt, crowing like they're auditioning for a gong show. This, my friend, is where the fancy court clocks end and folk life begins. Because the beauty of ancient Korean timekeeping isn't just in its inventions. It's in how people outside the palace adapted them, ignored them, or sometimes hilariously misunderstood them. You stop at a roadside vendor selling dried fish. She's got a basket balanced on her head, a twinkle in her eye, and an hourglass hanging from her cart. Not one of those sleek Western ones, but a clunky wooden frame with gritty black sand. She flips it casually. When the sand runs out, she says, you better have picked your fish. You ask how long it lasts. She shrugs. Long enough for you to stop being picky. See, unlike the court, village time is flexible. Measured not in minutes, but in meals, shadows, and chicken noises. A farmer tells you he gauges time by how far his shadow stretches across the cabbage rows. If it touches the third furrow, he says, I go home. You ask if that changes with the season. Of course, he replies, that's the point. Here, time bends with nature. Clouds can delay your day. Roosters can cheat with early crows. The sun isn't always reliable, and let's not even talk about foggy mornings. Which brings us to a curious invention, the Rooster sundial. Yes, that's a real thing. You stumble upon one in a temple courtyard. A wide stone disc carved with 12 sections, each marked not just with hour indicators, but with tiny zodiac roosters perched on spikes. A metal rod juts upward. Its shadow tells the time. But the rooster statues, they're there for symbolism, not science. Or so you think. An old monk appears beside you, sweeping slowly with a worn broom. That sundial isn't just for time, he whispers. It's for a reminder. He points at the rooster statues. The rooster crows not just to wake you, but to warn you. When the shadow hits its beak, it's time for prayer. When it touches its tail, it's time to reflect. You blink. So the rooster isn't a clock. It's a moral compass. Historians still argue whether this sundial-rooster hybrid was widely used or just one temple's artistic flair. Some believe it was created during a drought, when water clocks faltered and monks needed something spiritual yet functional. But here's the twist. The rooster becomes a timekeeper across all classes. In marketplaces, hand-drawn posters show cartoon roosters at different stages of the day. Children are taught rhymes like, if the rooster stands, you stand. If it pecks, you eat. If it sleeps, you sleep. It's not science, it's a social memory. You enter a village schoolhouse where kids recite times of day using bird behavior. The sparrow chirps at breakfast. The pigeon calls at the market hour. The rooster sings when honor begins. You try to keep up. You fail, but it's charming anyway. These aren't standardized systems, but they work. People know when to visit neighbors, when to close shop, and when to stay indoors just by watching the birds and listening to sounds. And here's something fun. Court officials hate this. There are records, actual royal edicts, where ministers beg commoners to stop relying on animal clocks. One reads, "The rooster is not the sun. Cease interpreting his crow as divine appointment." Naturally, people ignore them. Instead, they double down. Artisans begin crafting clay rooster whistles that chirp at specific hours, not because they're accurate, but because they're adorable and familiar. In one household, a mother tells her child, "Blow your rooster whistle after lunch so your father knows it's time to return from the fields." The kid does. The father returns. Who needs bells? Meanwhile, in the bustling heart of Hanyang, timekeeping starts to diversify dangerously. You meet a blacksmith who times his forge with egg boiling. He places an egg in water, starts hammering. When the egg is cooked, he quenches the blade. His logic? If the egg's good, the blade's good. You nod slowly. You do not eat the egg. But it's not all jokes. Across the kingdom, there's a growing problem: clock confusion. A merchant sets meetings by the water clock. A farmer arrives at the rooster crow. A monk thinks it's still prayer hour. Tempers flare, deals fall apart, marriages are delayed. One scholar sarcastically writes, "We have invented 1,000 clocks, and now no one knows the time." So, in a bid for unity, the royal court launches a campaign: standard time through bells. Every district is given a large ceremonial drum or bell. At specific hours, these are to be rung in unison, synced to the palace water clock. The sound travels, echoing across valleys, forests, and rice paddies. You witness it once, standing atop a village hill as 12 drums thunder from every direction. The ground hums. A baby starts crying. A chicken faints. But something magical happens. People begin to agree on time. The merchant arrives on cue. The farmer stops arguing. The monk adjusts his prayers. Time becomes shared again, not personal but communal. Still, not everyone gets the memo. You wander into a distant coastal town where they've invented something truly bizarre: the clam clock. No joke. A fisherman shows you a row of shallow bowls, each with a single clam and a tiny painted stick. When the clam opens, he says, the stick tips over. That's how we know it's time to bait the traps. You squint. What if the clam naps? He shrugs. Then the traps wait. Historians still argue whether the clam clock was ever meant seriously or if it was just coastal humor taken too far. Either way, you've now officially seen a mollusk measure time. Mark that off your life bingo card. As the day fades, you sit beside a grandmother weaving straw mats by hand. She hums softly, weaving in rhythm. "Do you use the clock?" you ask. She shakes her head. "No need. My hands know the day. When I've woven 20 mats, the sun will be gone, and I'll go to sleep." You stare at her hands, wrinkled, calm, precise, and you realize something. For all the clocks and gadgets, for all the court debates and rooster statues, the most reliable timekeeper isn't brass or water or even birds. It's a habit, memory, muscle. Time for these people isn't imposed, it's felt. And that's what makes this part of the story so rich. Not just that Korea invented complex clocks, but that its people made time their own in every silly, sacred, stubborn way possible. So next time your phone buzzes or your smartwatch shames you for sitting too long, think of the clam clock, or the Rooster dial, or the boy counting toy spins in a hut. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel time instead of fearing it. Your journey picks up again in the quiet pre-dawn hours, just before light breaks across the Korean peninsula, when the stars still hang like sleepy spectators. You're walking through the royal palace gardens now, where the air is crisp and the silence feels ceremonial. Everything's hushed, except for the gentle dripping of water echoing through stone courtyards. And there, tucked behind the main pavilion, sits a structure that looks part shrine, part laboratory. This is where it all gets serious again, because you're about to witness the birth of Korea's most iconic water clock. A contraption so clever it made kings sigh with pride and foreign emissaries raised their eyebrows like, "Excuse me, it does what now?" This marvel is called the Jagyongnu, a name that sounds like a spell and honestly might as well be. Imagine a multi-tiered tower made of lacquered wood and brass, surrounded by pots, spouts, pulleys, and carved dragons. The first time you see it in motion, it feels less like a timepiece and more like performance art. Water flows gently from one container to another, always at a measured rate. As the water level rises in a float chamber, it gradually lifts a wooden float connected to a series of mechanical triggers. And then, click. At the right moment, something wonderful happens. A small metal ball is released from a dragon's mouth. It rolls down a winding chute and lands in a resonating bell below. Gong. At the same moment, a wooden puppet holding a tablet steps out of a hidden door and displays the exact time to anyone watching. And yes, your eyes did not deceive you. That puppet just announced the hour. Let's pause here for a second. You're standing in the 15th century. Europe is still trying to sort out pendulums. Meanwhile, Korea is out here doing animatronics. Puppet butlers telling time. Dragons timing their drip. You probably won't survive this level of sophistication. So before you get too comfortable, remember to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know what hour you're traveling through with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease deeper into tonight's journey together. Because what you're seeing isn't just a fancy machine, it's a statement. The Jagyongnu was developed under King Sejong's reign, that same enlightened monarch who gave Korea its alphabet, championed science, and basically did more in a decade than most kings managed in a dynasty. He wasn't just building clocks, he was defining time for a kingdom. Why? Because relying on sundials didn't cut it anymore. Too cloudy, too moody. And the water clocks used before? They needed human intervention to ring bells manually. So Sejong called in his best engineer, Jong Yong-sil. This guy, a total legend, born a commoner, rose through talent, ended up designing devices that not only amazed the Korean court, but impressed visitors from China and beyond. And yes, historians still argue whether Jang Yong-sil truly invented every piece of the Jagyongnu, or if he adapted earlier Chinese models. Either way, he's the one who made it sing. Or rather, gong, and what a sound it makes. You close your eyes and let it wash over you. The metallic chime, deep and resonant, cutting through the night like the voice of time itself. But the real genius? It didn't just strike the hour. Oh no. It automated multiple hourly events, something unheard of in most parts of the world. Bell gongs, drums beat, puppets move, tablets rotate. It's like someone handed timekeeping over to a theater troupe and said, "Make it dramatic," and it worked. Ministers would literally stop mid-step to check the time from across the courtyard. Guards would adjust patrols. Servants would start rituals. It brought rhythm to palace life, like a conductor raising his baton. And just in case you're wondering how accurate it was, ridiculously so, modern reconstructions suggest that Jagyeongnu could keep time within a few minutes over many hours, rivaling clocks that came centuries later, and all with just gravity, water, and brain power. But here's where it gets even cooler. You peek behind the panels of this clock, and you see no gears, no springs. It's powered by hydraulic pressure and counterweights. The flow rate is adjusted by temperature-compensated water channels. Because, yes, water viscosity changes with temperature, and they knew that. Some channels were shaded or buried to prevent overheating. That's not just clever. It's low-tech genius on par with anything Da Vinci could have doodled. And speaking of doodles, the plans for the Jagyeongnu weren't just engineering diagrams, they were works of calligraphic art, painstakingly drawn in scrolls, annotated with poetic notes about water, whispering its secrets, and dragons bearing the burden of time. You reach out and touch one of those dragons, a sculpture worn smooth by centuries. Its eyes stare forward, eternally calm, like it knows all the hours that have passed and all the ones still to come. Now, naturally, you're thinking, did everyone get to enjoy this marvel? Nope, not even close. The Jagyeongnu was palace exclusive, a literal time fortress. Its precision and spectacle were reserved for royalty and officials, part of the grand performance of governance. Outside its halls, the rest of the country still relied on bells, roosters, and shadow measurements, but even so, its influence rippled outward. Skilled artisans created simplified versions, smaller, less theatrical water clocks. For provincial offices and temples, you even hear rumors of one being used in a noblewoman's private estate, tucked away behind a lotus pond. One traveler writes of hearing the soft plink of water and the echo of a tiny bell while walking past a window. He called it the heartbeat of the noble house. Still, these clocks weren't for everyone. They were expensive, delicate, temperamental during freezing winters. And if a servant forgot to refill the upper water chamber, the whole system just gave up and sulked until someone noticed. Yet despite those limits, the cultural impact was massive. Think of it this way. Korea didn't just build a timekeeping device. It took time. In a place where Confucian rituals were tied to specific hours, where ceremonies and astronomy danced hand in hand, the Jagyeongnu turned abstract hours into living events. It didn't just tell you it was the 5th hour. It showed you, with a puppet stepping forth, a bell chiming, a dragon nodding its approval. That, dear friend, is the difference between a timepiece and a timekeeper. And before you wander off, let me share one more strange tidbit. There's a story, half legend, half bureaucratic tragedy, about how one of the later kings demanded the Jagyeongnu be upgraded with newer materials. Bronze, maybe even imported iron. The work began. Artisans dismantled the clock. And then, it was never quite the same again. Some say the soul of the original clock, whatever mystical balance it had, was lost. The puppets jerked unnaturally. The bell tone became dull. Eventually, the whole thing was retired, locked away behind palace walls. To this day, scholars debate whether the original clock was ever rebuilt as intended, or if it died with the ambitions of the king who tried to perfect what was already sublime. But in your quiet, moonlit moment beside it, you don't need perfection. You just need the whisper of water, the gleam of brass, and the knowledge that long before atomic clocks and smartwatches, someone here had the audacity to build a clock that sang. And it still echoes, faintly, beautifully, across the centuries. The bell has rung, the puppet has bowed, and now you drift a little farther into the palace, the sound of flowing water still murmuring behind you like time itself trailing your heels. As the sun rises in amber, streaks across the rooftops, you find yourself in a less grand chamber filled not with golden dragons or dramatic bells, but scrolls. So many scrolls. This is the Songmunguan, the royal court's scholarly engine. It smells like ink and ambition, and right now it's buzzing, because you're about to witness the most intense thing any royal court could face in the 15th century. An accuracy audit. Yep. Even in ancient Korea, some poor soul had to double-check the time. You see, a brilliant water clock like the Jagyongnu couldn't just be built, admired, and left alone. It needed to be constantly compared to something, a reference, a control. Because in a world of rituals, astronomy, and precision, being off by a single moment could mean missing a ceremony, misreading a celestial omen, or, heaven forbid, making the king wait. So how did they verify if the clock was accurate? Enter the gnomon. It sounds like a villain from a fantasy novel, but it's just a vertical rod that casts a shadow. You've probably used one without realizing it, also known as a sundial. In the palace, however, this humble tool was anything but casual. Positioned in the courtyard where light fell cleanly, the gnomon became a cosmic ruler, measuring the exact position of the sun throughout the day. And, as the sunlight crept across the engraved dial, trained astronomer officials would jot down every shift. Noon was the key moment, when the sun stood highest and shadows reached their shortest length. This moment, this precise solar peak, was used to calibrate the water clock daily. You can almost hear the scribes muttering to themselves, heads bent over their charts, trying to ensure that the dragon's bell didn't dare ring a minute too early or too late. And if it did, well, here's the quirky part. The water clock didn't get scolded. The attendant did. As in the poor official who was supposed to top up the water, clear debris, and check float alignment. There are actual records of these guys being fined, demoted, or, in one tragically hilarious case, given extra duties that included polishing the king's sandals. You lean over a dusty scroll and your fingers trace the neat columns of a calendar divided by clepsydra hours. It's mesmerizing. Some pages are inked with red warnings. Cloudy, gnomon invalid. Other lines bear annotations like sun overcast, time by bell alone. It's timekeeping, weather tracking, and political accountability all in one tidy logbook. Historians still argue whether these logs were actually shared with China or if they were just for internal review. Some suggest diplomatic reports referenced Korea's hour-keeping miracles, while others believe it was all state propaganda, a royal flex dressed up in ink. And you know what? Both could be true. You pace down a corridor now, where another curious innovation waits, a noon cannon. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. This is Korea's fusion of pyrotechnics and punctuality. Around the 16th century, the palace introduced a system that used concentrated sunlight and a lens to ignite a fuse that fired a small cannon exactly at noon. Boom. The official time, served hot and loud. You stare at the contraption, essentially a magnifying glass pointed at a fuse. When the sun hits the perfect angle, Spark. Whoosh. Bang. Simple. Elegant. And just a little chaotic. This wasn't some child's science fair project. This was a serious tool used to announce solar noon to the entire capital. Farmers, merchants, court ladies, soldiers. Everyone could pause and say, "Ah, it's noon. Time to overcook lunch." The combination of water clocks, gnomons, and sun cannons turned the Joseon court into a temporal fortress. They weren't just passively following time, they were orchestrating it. But let's pull back the lens a bit. What drove all this obsession? You might think it was just royal pride or the usual astronomical curiosity that many ancient empires shared. But in Korea, it went deeper. Time was moral. In Confucian thought, every hour had a purpose. Morning was for learning, noon for meals and rest, evening for reflection and duty. Knowing the hour wasn't just about telling time, it was about behaving correctly. And that's why timekeeping in Korea wasn't left to chance. It was ritualized. Officers of the Bureau of Astronomy would present daily time reports to court officials. Public offices would open and close according to officially sanctioned hours. Festivals, mourning periods, and ancestral rites were all pegged to celestial and clock cycles. And when timekeeping faltered, trust in the state could wobble. That might sound dramatic, but imagine this. If a public bell rings late during a national ritual, the people wonder, is the government losing control? Is the cosmos displeased? There's even an old proverb, if the rooster crows wrong, the sun may not rise. That's not just folklore, that's existential anxiety with feathers. Speaking of roosters, yes, we're getting back to them soon. But first, let's get a bit poetic. Because tucked into the palace archives, among the engineering diagrams and sun charts, are poems, time poems, written by kings, scholars, and court ladies. One short verse reads, "Water drops down as stars blink out, a puppet bows, and I recall my mother's funeral bell." Time wasn't cold or mathematical in Joseon, Korea. It was emotional, personal, sacred. You now move through a side hall where a preserved panel of the old Gyeongbokgung Palace water clock is displayed under glass. It's not running anymore, but the elegance is still there. Etched patterns, glinting copper dragons, the curve of the water chute. It feels like looking at a sleeping animal. Not dead, just waiting for the right hour to awaken again. But don't get too dreamy, because here's your next quirky nugget. In 1439, during one of the Jugyeongnu maintenance phases, the king's astrologers apparently panicked. Why? Because a lunar eclipse occurred shortly after the puppet missed a chime. They linked the two events. Panic spread. An emergency scroll was written warning of a possible rift between heaven and man. You can't help but laugh gently. Imagine blaming your broken alarm clock for the next solar event. But hey, back then everything was a sign. A goat tripping over a stone, portent. Your calendar gets wet, omen. Your puppet clogs up. Apocalyptic danger. Historians still debate whether these superstitions were sincerely held or if court officials used them politically to stall decisions or shift blame. Either way, clocks had power, and power made people nervous. So nervous, in fact, that some officials petitioned to reduce public knowledge of time. Why? Because they feared commoners might misinterpret or misuse it. That's right, clock gatekeeping. A very old tradition, but not everyone agreed. Some reform-minded scholars argued that sharing time widely was a moral duty, that laborers deserved to know when to rest, monks when to chant, and children when to stop running wild and come home. Which brings us, finally, to the slow democratization of time. As the centuries rolled on, simplified water clocks and solar dials began appearing outside the palace, in markets, in monasteries, even in rural schools where children practiced reading shadow lengths as part of their basic education. One illustrated textbook shows a group of boys measuring their teacher's nose with a gnomon. Apparently, that was the fun assignment. And though these clocks weren't as flashy as the Jagyungnu, they did something beautiful. They shared power. Not political power, but temporal power. The ability to mark one's day, to plan, to anticipate, to remember. You glance once more at the clock tower in the palace courtyard. Its dragon eyes no longer move. The puppet's doors stay shut, but you swear, for just a heartbeat, you hear the echo of the bell. And you know the world kept turning. Because in this chapter of timekeeping, Korea didn't just chase the minutes. It shaped them into ceremony, performance, and rhythm. And the puppets? They danced not for machines, but for meaning. You wander beyond the scholarly wings now, out through a smaller wooden gate nestled between whispering pines and courtyard stones, worn smooth by royal sandals and hurried messengers. The palace behind you dims in memory, like a story already half faded. Ahead lies something different, not less precise, not less important, just a little more down to earth. Because even though water clocks and cannon-firing lenses dazzled the elite, most people in Joseon Korea had never seen a dragon puppet announce the hour. Not once. Not ever. Out in the villages, on the misty slopes where farmers coaxed barley from stubborn soil, time moved to a simpler beat. And here's where you meet an unlikely but utterly reliable timekeeper, the Rooster. You stop at the edge of a field at dawn. The grass is wet with dew, and the mountains still wear their fog like a morning coat. Then, clear and sharp, you hear it. Cock-a-doodle-doo. Or, well, the Korean version, kokyo. It's shrill, it's proud, and most importantly, it's on time. You'd think this humble bird wouldn't stand a chance against copper spouts and hydraulic floats. But to the average farmer, the rooster was the most consistent timekeeper they had. You wake when it crows. You break for rice porridge at the second call. And when it quiets down by mid-morning, you know the workday has begun in earnest. We're talking about a centuries-old alliance here, man and rooster, peasants and poultry. And the rooster took its job seriously. In fact, there's an entire category of folktales in Korea about faithful roosters, birds who save villages by crowing at the right moment to warn of bandits, or to mark a safe return from the spirit world, or even to break curses. Yes, in some stories, curses are lifted not by brave warriors, but by punctual poultry. You can't make this stuff up, except someone definitely did. But that's the point. The rooster became more than a bird. It became a symbol of time itself. And naturally, the symbolism crept into more official channels. Which brings us to a peculiar but deeply Korean innovation, the rooster statue timekeeper. That's right. Somewhere along the way, the real bird's job performance impressed people enough that they decided to immortalize it in stone, bronze, and ceramic. At first, these were simple totems. You'd find them in village squares, perched on wooden poles or stone stumps facing east, because, of course, that's where the sun comes up. But soon, these statues weren't just symbolic, they became functional. You approach one now in a small town market. It's perched atop a wide circular base, flanked by hour markings carved in Hangul and old Chinese numerals. But it's not just decoration. The rooster's beak contains a slit, and just beneath it lies a hollow groove running down the pole into a bell chamber. did it work? It was primitive, but brilliant. A small amount of water, again, we return to our beloved water, would be poured into a funnel hidden in the rooster's crown at night. The water would trickle slowly through the narrow tube. By the time it reached the bottom, just before dawn, it would hit a metal plate. Clang. Not a loud noise, mind you, just enough. Enough to wake a nearby attendant who would then rise, stretch, and bang an actual bell to wake the town. The rooster didn't crow, but it nudged someone who could. If this sounds overcomplicated, you haven't lived in a world without alarms. And these statues? They were community treasures. Villagers gathered around them at festivals. Children were told to respect them. In some towns, people would leave small offerings, grains, coins, even folded paper charms, at the base to ensure the rooster stayed honest. One elderly monk even wrote that he whispered secrets to his rooster statue, trusting it to wake not just the village, but the soul. Historians still argue whether these semi-functional rooster timekeepers were widespread or just a local curiosity. Some claim there were dozens across Joseon, Korea. Others suggest it was more symbolic, a single village's obsession that got written about more than it deserved. But you know what? When you're standing in the soft blue hour, with mist curling around your ankles and a bronze bird glinting on a pedestal, the truth doesn't matter as much as the memory. And roosters weren't alone. They had a whole crew of timekeeping animals in Korean lore. There were tiger bells, used in temples to call monks to prayer, ox horns, blown at certain times during mountain rituals, and even carp statues, because fish in Korean folklore never sleep, and so make excellent watchers of time. But none matched the rooster for sheer reliability. It became so synonymous with punctuality that a Korean insult from the 1700s went, "He's like a rooster who crows after the sun." Translation? Late, unhelpful, loud for no reason. You keep walking now, following the trail of crowing through rural towns, and you realize something. While clocks in the palace were precise, these village methods were rhythmic, organic. You'd see the sun and think, time to fetch water. Hear the millstone and say, the neighbors are baking. Or follow the rooster's third call to head toward the fields. It was less about exact hours, more about communal awareness. In that sense, time wasn't just measured, it was shared. And shared time brings us to another sleepy innovation, the musical drum tower. Picture this. A tall wooden tower in the center of a village. Inside, a huge drum made of cowhide, painted with clouds and cranes. Every morning and evening, someone, usually a designated time drummer, would climb up and beat a slow, measured rhythm. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. It wasn't just music, it was a signal. The day has begun, or it's time to come inside, or in less poetic terms, stop loitering by the well and go home. And here's your quirky moment of the section. In the town of Jongseon, one local drummer in the 1600s became famous for falling asleep at his post. Legend says he missed the evening beat so often that townspeople began using his snoring as the unofficial evening signal. To this day, the town's dialect includes the phrase, "when the drummer sleeps," meaning it's late. You can't help but chuckle at that. But beneath the humor is something quietly profound. For most people in pre-modern Korea, time wasn't something you possessed. It wasn't ticking in your pocket or glowing on your wrist. It was outside you, heard in roosters, seen in shadows, felt in rhythm. It was part of the environment, not your calendar app. That's why even when mechanical clocks arrived, huge imported things from Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century, they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. People marveled at them, yes, but they also whispered, "Can you trust a machine to know when your father's spirit visits?" Spooky? Maybe, but honestly, timekeeping for centuries wasn't just about minutes, it was about meaning. And the rooster? He never forgot that. So now, as dusk slips in again, you find yourself near one last statue. It's tucked into the moss behind a Buddhist hermitage. The bird is small, chipped at the beak, wings folded against its sides. No one pours water through it anymore, but there's a fresh flower at its base. Someone remembered. And for a long moment, you simply sit beside it, listening. There's no ticking, no bell, no puppet announcing the hour, just wind in the reeds, a distant child laughing. And far off, one last rooster curls through the fading blue air like the last syllable of a song. You wake again, this time not to the crow of a rooster, but to a deep, echoing chime that rolls over the hills like a slow wave. Somewhere ahead, over the spine of the mountains, a giant bronze bell is being struck. And this one doesn't signal breakfast or the changing of palace guards. It speaks to the heavens, the ancestors, and the deepest layers of Joseon Korean timekeeping. You stretch your neck, peer through the misty trees, and follow the sound. It leads you up a winding forest trail toward a temple, nestled halfway up a cliffside. It's not big, just a curved roofline, wind chimes dangling like sleepy punctuation marks, and the rhythmic beating of a moktak, a small wooden percussion block used in chanting. But we're not here for chanting. We're here for the temple bell of time. Now, you've seen bells before. You've seen those tiny desk ones teachers use when they're done explaining algebra. You've probably even seen church bells clanging in old Western films. But this is something else. It's massive, at least the height of two full-grown monks stacked on top of each other, assuming they agree to hold very still and not wiggle. Its bronze surface is covered in carved dragons, floating lotus petals, and Hangul inscriptions so old they look like river patterns. And when it rings, the entire valley seems to pause. In many Korean temples, especially during the later Joseon era, these bells weren't just ceremonial. They kept time, not in minutes or seconds, but in spiritual slices of the day. Here's how it worked. Monks would strike the bell a set number of times at dawn, dusk, and during specific rituals. Locals down in the valley would hear it and adjust their lives accordingly. Some would light incense, others would return from the fields. Children knew when to stop playing and head home for rice and fermented radish. And elders would close their eyes and whisper quiet thanks that the bell still rang, that the world was still spinning in rhythm. In fact, it became so reliable that even villages without temples started lobbying for their own prayer bell towers, kind of like rural satellites of the original source. They might be smaller, wooden even, but if they could capture that low musical tone, it was worth it. And here's your historical fact drop of the night. The Emil Bell, also known as the Bell of King Seongdeok, is one of the most famous Korean temple bells ever cast. Created in the unified Silla period, centuries before Joseon, it's said to produce a sound so pure that it rings for 3 full minutes after being struck once. The Joseon scholars studied it, admired it, even modeled smaller bells after its shape and tone. Now, whether any actual Joseon bell rang that long, that's up for debate. Historians still argue whether the Emil legend is an exaggeration or the result of unique metallurgy techniques now lost to time. One theory even claims a small child's soul was trapped inside to give it its voice. But let's not get too ghosty tonight. You're trying to sleep. The important bit is this. Temple bells became the morning and evening anchors of daily life in large swaths of Korea. Before the rooster crowed, before the sun peeped over the ridge, the bell told you what kind of day it would be. Rainy morning? Still the bell rang. Funeral procession coming through? It rang slower, softer. Festival day? Faster rhythm, more joy. This idea that the tone of a bell could influence the emotional weather of a community isn't just poetic fluff. It was real. Monks took their job very seriously, training for years to develop the perfect swing, the precise weight and angle so the bell would sing, not clunk. And the people listened. But bells weren't the only sonic timekeepers around. Let's pivot slightly into the world of watchman gongs. Back in the more urban parts of Joseon, especially in places like Hanyang, modern-day Seoul, you had a different kind of nightly rhythm. The cities, unlike rural temples, couldn't rely on spiritual chants and roosters alone. They needed security. Enter the pojang, or night watchman. Dressed in rough cloth, often carrying a lantern and a small wooden club, not for fighting, but for banging on gates and drums, the pojang was your alarm clock, street patrol, and gossip courier all rolled into one. Every 2 hours through the night, he would strike a gong or clap 2 thick wooden sticks together and call out the night watch time interval, a system adopted from Chinese timekeeping methods but localized in tone and flavor. The calls went something like this. First watch. Sleep if you must, but guard your dreams. Second watch. All's calm. Keep your lanterns low. Third watch. Dawn whispers behind the wall. Admit it, you'd sleep better with poetry like that echoing outside your window. The 5-night watch system divided the night into equal portions, usually about 2 hours each. This was useful not just for city dwellers, but also for military bases, merchant courtyards, and even inns. If you were running a guest house and heard the third watch bell, you knew it was time to start brewing hot water and preparing the rice. And yes, before you ask, there were definitely rivalries between temple bell strikers and city watchmen. While one called to the soul, the other summoned practical order. One monk even grumbled in his journal that the city gongs clash against the stillness of the Buddha's time. To which a city guard reportedly replied, "If Buddha gets mugged, don't come crying to me." Korean sarcasm. It runs deep. But we'd be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about the queen of all timekeeping sounds, the drum of Gyeonghwaru Pavilion. Located in the royal palace itself, this enormous pavilion stood on stilts above an artificial pond. Inside it, the royal timekeepers sometimes hosted ceremonies involving a gigantic drum that could be heard across half the capital. The drumming wasn't daily. It was reserved for state rituals, diplomatic events, and seasonal changes. When the drum pounded, everyone knew something important was happening. And here's your quirky tidbit. The drum was so loud that during one ceremony, it reportedly caused a nobleman's toupee, yes, they wore hairpieces, to fly off into the royal soup. Nobody acknowledged it. The drum just kept pounding. Time doesn't pause for wigs, but whether it was bells, gongs, roosters, or drums, the message was always the same. Wake up. Pay attention. Time is moving. So as you walk back now through the shaded trail, past silent bells and sleeping rooster statues, past shuttered drum towers and gongs hung on hooks, you realize something. Koreans didn't just measure time, they conducted it. It was music. Each element, the rooster, the monk, the guard, the noble's lost toupee, played a role in a sonic orchestra of daily life. It wasn't precise like your modern smartphone, but it felt more deeply. And as the moon rises above the old tiled roofs, silvering the path before you, you can still hear it. The long echoing tone of a temple bell struck an hour ago. Not loud now, just there. A gentle reminder that some songs, once played, don't end. They fade. You wipe a bit of dew from your cheek as you descend from the mountain temple. The valley below is shifting into morning's soft glow, and somewhere in the distance, another rooster statue begins to crow. Okay, not really crow, but whistling gently through hidden reeds when the wind hits just right. It's your cue. A new phase of the journey is calling. You've tracked water clocks, rooster statues, bells, and the jangling rhythm of watchmen. But now it's time to head to the royal court, where the real drama of timekeeping unfolds like a perfectly folded fan. You walk beneath the painted eaves of Gyeongbokgung Palace, past lotus ponds and granite courtyards, until you arrive at a low, official-looking hall, the residence of the Gwansangam, or Royal Bureau of Astronomy and Calendrical Science. This isn't your average dusty science office. These were the time overlords of Joseon, Korea. Royal technicians, astronomers, astrologers, and mechanical engineers who held the sacred job of measuring, calculating, and deciding what time it actually was. And here's your mainstream historical fact. The Gwansangam was established in 1432 under King Sejong the Great. Yes, the same genius who gave Korea its beloved Hangul writing system. Because Sejong wasn't just a king, he was a full-on nerd. And he knew that if his people couldn't agree on when the day started, or when the crops should be planted, or when the moon festival really began, the kingdom might just descend into scheduling chaos. So he gathered the brightest minds and said, "Hey, let's build a time lab." Not literally, but the result was the same. Inside the Gwansangam, scholars peered through star charts, scribbled in books made of oiled mulberry paper, and ran calculations using abacuses that clicked like impatient bones. They were obsessed with precision. The water clocks from earlier, the Gwansangam helped design and maintain them. The bell schedules, they orchestrated those too. The lunar calendars, oh boy, they basically had an emotional relationship with lunar phases. But here's the quirky tidbit for tonight. In some records, it said that the court's astronomers were so competitive that one group tried to outmeasure another by sneaking into the observatory after hours to correct the star positioning. Their punishment? Forced to copy thousands of tiny numerical tables by hand, with brushes on bamboo slips, in January, bare-fingered. The Joseon Royal Science Crew did not play around. One of their crowning achievements was the Jagyeong-nu, a masterwork of water clock engineering designed to be fully automatic. You remember the old school bronze bowls with holes in the bottom? That was like Pong. The Jagyeong-nu was the PS5. It used water pressure, floats, gears, pulleys, and even small figurines that struck gongs and drums at precise times. It could announce the hours day and night without human intervention. King Sejong commissioned an improved version around 1434, and the team led by Jang Yong-sil, a brilliant inventor with the coolest name ever, delivered. And not just once. The Gwansangam made multiple models for the court and regional outposts, ensuring that even the provinces could join the ticking harmony of the empire. But here's where things get a little heated, because historians still argue whether the later water clocks matched the accuracy of earlier ones from the Silla or Goryeo periods. Some claim Sejong's clocks were more elaborate, but not necessarily more precise. Others say they marked a huge leap in mechanization and autonomy. No one's totally sure because only fragments of the original devices survive. Bronze, lion heads, partial dials, and one heroic-looking water basin. You stare into one of the preserved clock pits now. It's shallow, moss-lined, with rusted pegs where machinery once stood. In your mind, you reconstruct it. Paddles spinning, drums sounding, water rising and falling like a quiet breath. And you realize this wasn't just a clock, it was a living sculpture. But the Gwansongam didn't stop at clocks. Oh no, they also made calendars. And these weren't like your dentist appointment calendar with puppies on it. They were painstakingly calculated lunar-solar hybrids, merging Chinese astrological systems with homegrown Korean observations. They tracked eclipses, solar terms, and rare planetary alignments. Because in Joseon, time wasn't just linear, it was cosmic. A farmer planting barley needed to know not just the season, but the heavenly energy associated with it. Was Mars in a fire sign sector? Did the moon enter the White Tiger constellation? Better wait a day. That's not superstition. That's calendar science, baby. But all this knowledge came with a catch. If time was a royal science, then it was also royal property. Which means that for much of Joseon history, unauthorized timekeeping was illegal. Let that settle in. If you were a commoner and tried to make your own calendar, or invent your own sundial, or say something like, "I think it's a leap year," you could get fined, or worse, accused of stealing time. That's how seriously they took this stuff. So timekeeping wasn't just about mechanics, it was about power. And nobody knew that better than the court astrologers. These folks were the ones whispering into the king's ear that a comet foretold political danger, that a lunar eclipse meant his younger brother should not be trusted, that the current month was perfect for launching a reform, but not for marriage. Many decisions were timed not by practicality, but by planetary positioning. Want a debate? Historians still argue whether King Seijo timed his coup against his nephew based on astrological advice from Gwansongam officials. Some say he acted during an auspicious window. Others claim it was just a coincidence. But either way, he succeeded, so the stars seem to have agreed. You make your way down a marble corridor now, trailing your fingers across the chilled stone walls of the old observatory chamber. Outside, the sun is fully risen, casting slanted beams across the tiled roofs. You glance up and catch a metal fixture jutting from a corner balcony, a simplified armillary sphere used for solar tracking. Kind of like a royal sundial, but more dramatic. A scholar once stood there, eyes squinting into the sunlight, adjusting bronze rings to line up with the equinox. He was measuring the length of the shadow cast by the midday sun on the spring equinox, part of a process to fine-tune seasonal dates. If the shadow was too long or short, they'd adjust the calendar accordingly. Imagine reprinting an entire year's worth of date books because of one skinny shadow. But for them, this was normal. It was the duty of kings and scholars alike to align the kingdom with the heavens. Which leads us to tonight's final point. In Joseon, you didn't just live in time, you lived in harmony with it. Roosters, bells, gongs, clocks, drums, calendars, stars, all of them were instruments in a grand cosmic orchestra that played not for profit or speed or clicks, but for balance. The year had to be balanced. The seasons had to be balanced. Even the moments between drum beats were considered. And if they got it wrong, crops could fail, storms could come early, the people would grow restless, and worst of all, the stars might go silent. So as you step outside the palace gates, leaving behind centuries of ticking water wheels and scribbled star charts, you realize something. The Gwansangam wasn't just Korea's NASA, it was Korea's heartbeat. And time? Time was a kind of prayer, whispered daily through gears and water, bells and breath. You pause outside the palace gates, taking in a deep breath that smells faintly of pine, ink, and distant smoke from morning fires. The echo of drums, stars, and water wheels hums inside your mind like a lullaby you're only just beginning to understand. But don't get too cozy yet. We're not done with the mechanics of time. In fact, we're about to enter one of the most charming, slightly confusing, and yet brilliantly local traditions in Joseon, Korea: the public time announcements and their daily orchestration. Let's be honest, you probably don't have a drummer who follows you around your neighborhood every hour, tapping rhythmically on a ceremonial gong to remind you it's lunchtime. But if you'd lived in 18th century Hanyang, modern-day Seoul, that's exactly what you would have gotten. Remember the watches of the night from earlier? Those rhythmic bell and drum schedules weren't just for palace nerds and rooster statues. In fact, by the mid-Joseon period, the government had institutionalized public time announcements as a vital citywide service. Someone literally had the job title of bell ringer, or jonggakjang, which roughly translates to guy who makes time loud enough to hear. So here's your mainstream historical fact. In Joseon Seoul, every major gate in the city had its own timekeeping bell or drum system. There were 4 main city gates and 4 smaller ones, and each one served as both a security checkpoint and a giant public clock. And now for the quirky bit. These weren't quiet affairs. At dawn, a special ceremony called Paru would be performed at the Bosengak Belfry, located in the center of the city. A huge bronze bell weighing over 20 tons would be struck 33 times to announce the official start of the day. Why 33? According to some records, it symbolized the 33 heavens in ancient Buddhist cosmology. Yes, time and religion were pretty tight buddies in Joseon, Korea. But get this. When night fell and the city gates were about to close, the bell struck 28 times, which represented the 28 constellations used in East Asian astronomy. That's not just poetic, that's numerology, symbolism, civic order, and science, all baked into your daily alarm system. You try to imagine the sound: 33 gonging heartbeats echoing across tiled rooftops and curling around the hills, maybe shaking a bird from its tree or jolting a sleepy merchant awake. In an age before smartphones and watches, it was the sound of a city rising to its feet. And yes, you better believe it had choreography. There was a specific schedule, updated seasonally to align with sunrise and sunset. In the depths of winter, the bell rang later in the morning, in summer, earlier. Bellkeepers adjusted their routines based on astronomical calculations given to them by, you guessed it, the Gwansangam. So even though the mechanics of water clocks were mostly hidden inside royal palaces or observatories, the output of all that scientific brainpower spilled out into the streets through these bells. Now let's zoom in. Imagine you're a rice merchant. You wake not by alarm, but by Peru's bell. You roll up your straw mat, shake the dew off your eyebrows, and shuffle your way through the alleys of Jongno District. Everything smells like ash and scallions. A couple of oxen grunt behind you. Somewhere nearby, a boy's yelling about fish. This whole rhythm, is what happens when an entire city agrees on time. Even more impressively, every gate had to ring its bell at precisely the same time. But here's where it gets spicy. Historians still argue whether all the city gate bell keepers were actually synchronized. Some say there were messengers who ran between the central bell tower and the gates to shout, "Now!" Others claim that the bell sequence started with the Bosingak bell, and the others rang in rapid succession as the sound reached them, sort of like a stone skipping across water, each gate catching the vibration a moment later. But with no walkie-talkies or wireless signals, keeping perfect citywide time was an act of choreographed chaos. And then there were the roving drummers, officially known as Jongakdai units. These were small groups of uniformed men whose job was to patrol the city on foot at night and beat their drums at specific hour intervals. Think of them as mobile human cuckoo clocks with a strong sense of civic pride. Their drum beats echoed through narrow alleys and wooden hana courtyards, reminding people not just of the hour, but of order. They were the city's heartbeat after dark. And if that seems like overkill, don't forget, time was also tied to curfews and gate closings. If you were outside the walls of the capital after dark, you were on your own. No re-entry, no safe shelter, no help from guards. So that 28 bell ring at dusk, it was your cue to move it or lose it. A misplaced nap could cost you a night outdoors with the stray dogs and frost. Timekeeping then wasn't about punctuality. It was about survival. Of course, like any good system, it had its critics. Some city folk found the bells too loud. Some said the drummers were out of sync or skipped beats after a few too many rice wines. There are old complaints and personal letters with phrases like, "I swear the drummer passed 3 times tonight before it was even midnight," or "that bell must have cracked, my chickens took off again." Others missed the bells entirely, like a famous story of a nobleman who overslept a political meeting and tried to argue that the Bosingak bell hadn't rung at all. Spoiler, it had. He just slept through it, and the ministers weren't having it. Time waits for no Yangbon. But here's what really made it magical. Everyone, rich or poor, followed the same sounds. A butcher heard the same bell as a royal guard. A washerwoman and a government clerk both knew that 3 quick drum beats and a pause meant the 3rd watch of the night. It was one of the few truly universal experiences in a socially stratified world. In that way, the city's public time was democratic, but only in its sound. The science behind it, still tightly held by the elite. Which brings us to another point. This whole system required constant maintenance. Water clocks needed cleaning. Bell towers needed recalibrating. Watchmen had to memorize schedules. You couldn't just set and forget. Keeping a kingdom running on time was a living tradition, and for a while it worked like clockwork, literally. But eventually, change rang louder than any bell. Foreign missionaries, particularly Jesuits from Europe, began arriving in East Asia with their mechanical clocks and new astronomical theories. They introduced pendulum clocks, which were more precise and easier to use than water clocks. Even Korean officials were impressed. Pendulum clocks didn't need refilling or cleaning every few hours. They just ticked. By the late 1600s, some scholars at court began whispering that these Western clocks might be the way of the future. And by the late Joseon period, mechanical clocks began appearing in Korean palaces, tucked behind screens or used as exotic gifts. The era of fluid, water-driven time was slowly giving way to ticking gears. Still, the bell and drum systems continued well into the 20th century. Even today, the Bosingak bell is ceremonially rung every New Year's Eve, an echo of Joseon's devotion to time as something heard, felt, and lived. So as you sit down near the foot of the old belfry, listening to the wind tug at the high bronze rim, you wonder, how many footsteps have echoed here before yours? How many lives moved with the beat of that bell? You imagine a market woman wrapping up her last fish, a scholar rushing to the gates before they close, a sleepy boy startled awake by the midnight drummer, all of them held together by the sounds of time. And suddenly, you're not in 2025 anymore. You're in a city of shadows and lanterns where every sound means something, where time doesn't tick, it resonates. You haven't even dusted off your shoes before you're drawn once more into the hum of ancient innovation. Joseon Korea had a way of hiding genius in plain sight. And just when you think the story's slowing down, boom, another contraption appears, equal parts stunning and strange. And today you're getting a secret peek inside the most elite time machine Korea ever made. Well, not a DeLorean with flux capacitors, sorry, but an innovation so quiet, so perfectly designed, and so reserved for the upper crust that few people even knew how it worked. We're talking about a device that combined astronomy, hydraulics, and mechanical engineering, and was guarded like royal treasure. This was Jagyokru, a self-striking water clock. Now, you've seen water clocks before, the old bowl and bucket systems, the ones where water slowly filled a container, marking time as it rose. But this was no leaky bowl with a stick in it. No, sir. This was a glorious wood and metal marvel that looked more like a theater set crossed with a celestial observatory, because that's what it kind of was. So here's your mainstream historical fact. The Jagyokru, invented by scientist Jang Young-sil in the 15th century under King Sejong, was Asia's first self-striking water clock. It could measure time and announce it automatically with sound and movement. Let that sink in. It not only tracked time on its own, no human intervention required, but it also performed a little show every hour. Bells rang, wooden dolls moved, gongs chimed, and even metal balls dropped into waiting bowls like applause at the end of a scene. If you were standing in the royal palace and saw one of these things in action, you wouldn't know whether to clap or bow. But wait, it gets better. Let's dig into the guts of this thing. It started, of course, with water. Inside a sealed vessel, water would drip slowly and predictably into a second container. This container had a float in it, basically a hollow tube or a little wooden buoy. As the water level rose, the float would rise with it. Attached to the float, a rod and pulley system connected to gears and levers. These turned precisely measured discs that marked time increments. And every time a full hour passed, a chain of actions would unfold like dominoes falling. A small door would slide open. A mechanical puppet, yes, a little wooden figure, would step forward holding a bell or drumstick. It would strike a bell exactly once or sometimes multiple times depending on the hour. Then a second puppet might move, often a celestial figure or a courtier with a scroll. Metal balls would release and roll down inclined planes, clinking into bowls to mark minutes. This was automation before the word even existed. And not just any automation, ceremonial, symbolic, and theatrical. If today's timekeepers are smartwatches and Siri, this was Shakespeare in mechanical form. The Jagyokru wasn't just a way to know the time, it was a message. Time is sacred, science is royal, and Korea's court is serious about both. Now here's your quirky tidbit. One version of the Jagyokru had puppets that appeared as heavenly kings, modeled after Buddhist deities. These weren't just dolls, they were symbols of cosmic authority. Each movement carried spiritual weight. When the drum sounded, it wasn't just 9 o'clock. It was a reminder that heaven watched your every move. And maybe also that you should stop flirting with the kitchen staff and get back to your scrolls. But now we've got to ask, why was this not spread everywhere? Why wasn't every town square blessed with a delightful hourly puppet show? Here's where things get fuzzy. Historians still argue whether the Jagyokru was kept deliberately secret by the court. Some suggest that the mechanical designs were considered state-level technology, much like rocket schematics today. After all, time was power. If you could control the hours, you controlled everything else. Farming schedules, ceremonies, military movements, taxes, and even curfews. Others argue it just wasn't portable. I mean, you can't exactly strap a 6-foot self-striking water clock to a donkey and trot off to the provinces. Whatever the reason, one thing's clear, the Jagyokru didn't go mainstream, and in a strange twist of fate, it almost disappeared completely. Fast forward to centuries later, during the turmoil of wars, invasions, and colonization, many original models of the Jagyokru were destroyed or lost. What we know of them today comes from written records, sketches, manuals, and the stunned descriptions of people who saw them firsthand. But wait, there's a plot twist. In 2007, South Korean historians and engineers reconstructed a working model of the Jagyokru based on surviving blueprints and court records. And guess what? It worked. Exactly as described. Floating valves, precision movement, puppets, chimes, the whole shebang. After over 500 years, Jung Young-sil's genius clicked back into motion. You can see it today at the National Palace Museum in Seoul. It stands like a mechanical phoenix brought back to life. And yes, kids gasp, adults stare, tour guides pause reverently, because this is the moment when history stops being dusty and becomes real. Now let's take a breath and shift gears. Think about this for a second. You live in a society where time isn't just measured, it's performed. It's artistic, spiritual, state-sanctioned, and astronomically verified. And that's all before breakfast. Every movement of a puppet, every tick of a float, every drop of water had meaning. You could argue this was obsessive, over-engineered, extra, but you'd be missing the point. Because, for the scholars and kings of Joseon Korea, time was more than minutes and hours. It was a reflection of cosmic harmony, a way to align human behavior with the rhythms of heaven. The sun rose and set, not just because of physics, but because it was meant to. And by marking time with grace, beauty, and ritual, you were doing more than just staying on schedule. You were staying in balance. So next time you glance at your phone to check the time, imagine if instead a wooden deity emerged from a hidden alcove and clanged a bell 3 times before disappearing into the shadows. Not only would your meetings be more fun, but you'd probably never forget the hour again. Now, just when you think you've heard it all, a whispered footnote of history tiptoes in. According to some rumors, and these are tasty ones, one version of the Jagyokru might have included a mechanism that responded to moonlight. That's right, a lunar sensitive clock. Scholars aren't sure. The records are cryptic, and some believe it was a poetic metaphor. Others argue it may have had a light-sensitive trigger, like a primitive photosensor, using mirrors or oil lamp shadows to alter timing at night. It's unproven, but deliciously possible, because if that's true, then ancient Korea had a clock that responded to sun, water, and moon, which makes your phone's night mode look kind of lazy. As you stroll past the ghost of the Jagyokru, water still dripping somewhere in your imagination, you can't help but feel a strange kind of calm. Time wasn't always frantic, digitized, or shrunk to fit your wrist. Once, it was alive, ornate, full of ceremony and puppets. And in that world, you weren't chasing time, you were dancing with it. You've traveled far with the tick-tock of ancient Korean clocks echoing behind you. And yet, just as your mind begins to wander, perhaps toward a late-night snack or the cool side of your pillow, You find yourself stepping into the part of history that feels the most personal, the most human. Because now we're talking about you, or rather someone like you, someone living in the old villages of Joseon, Korea, someone without palace walls or self-striking clocks, someone who still needed to know when to wake, eat, work, pray, and rest. And let's be honest, unless you were royalty or a scholar who got excited about astronomical charts, your life was likely ruled by two much simpler things: the sky and the sound of animals. Let's talk about roosters. Yes, those loud feathered alarm clocks with absolutely no concept of weekends. They were the original timekeepers for the everyday Korean villager. Forget digital numbers and hourly chimes. The crow of a rooster at dawn was your signal to get moving. And here's your mainstream historical fact. For centuries, Korean farmers used the call of the rooster as a functional time signal, especially before clocks were accessible. In rural communities, the rooster's crow wasn't just morning noise, it was time. Time to rise, time to start fires, time to begin a long, aching day of fieldwork. Now, before you roll your eyes and mutter, "Okay, so birds yell in the morning. Big deal. Let me take you one level deeper." The rooster was mythologized. In Korean folklore, the rooster's crow didn't just signal light. It chased away evil. It was believed that when a rooster crowed, it frightened away ghosts, demons, and other uninvited nighttime visitors. So if you were a child lying awake in your thatched roof home, shadows flickering from the fireplace, the rooster's call wasn't annoying, it was reassuring. It meant the world was safe again. And now, your quirky tidbit. In some Joseon households, families would carve rooster statues. Yes, life-sized wooden or clay models of the mighty bird, and place them at the entrance of their homes. Why? Because the statue would trick spirits into thinking dawn had arrived, thereby scaring them off. The real bird slept in the yard, but the symbolic bird stood guard day and night. This practice was especially common during times of illness or mourning, when it was believed the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. The rooster statue was a spiritual gatekeeper, a kind of feathery bouncer for your front porch. And it didn't stop there. In some temples and noble homes, rooster imagery was woven into fabric, carved into pillars, or even painted near windows. Why windows? Because, according to some beliefs, that's where spirits slipped in, right past the moonlight and into your dreams. Which brings us to a delicious slice of superstition. Historians still argue whether the rooster statues were based on practical farming wisdom or spiritual storytelling. Some claim it was simply about training children to respect daily routines, using stories about ghosts to reinforce bedtime and morning discipline. Others insist the belief was far older, tied to ancient Korean shamanism and the idea that animal spirits could ward off chaos. Either way, you can imagine how a carved rooster would become more than decoration. It was both timekeeper and protector. And now, let's rewind to the villages. You're trudging through the pre-dawn mist. There's no electricity. The fields wait like a silent promise in the dark. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then silence. Then, caw, the rooster cries. It's not just noise, it's authority. It tells the world, time to move. Grandmothers shuffle out with kettles, young boys rub their eyes and collect tools, and the rhythm of the day begins. But roosters weren't alone in this natural orchestra. People also watched the sky like a living calendar. No smartphone weather apps, no digital planners. Just the sun, the moon, and the stars. Farmers had phrases, passed from mouth to mouth like family recipes, that told them when to plant, when to harvest, and when to expect storms. They watched the color of the sunrise, the behavior of birds, the way smoke drifted from a chimney. And in winter, when days were short and cold wrapped itself around the village like a wet blanket, people depended even more on rhythm. Wake with the rooster, warm the hearth, boil rice, feed animals, rest when the sun dips behind the mountains. You couldn't afford to lose track of time, not because you'd miss your train, but because your survival depended on rhythm. The timing of rice planting, the exact days for fermenting kimchi, the best moment to gather firewood before the snow came, all were tied to seasonal cues and animal calls. But humans are, well, humans. They like to decorate even the ordinary. So timekeeping in villages became a kind of art shaped by tradition. You'd hear aunties say things like, "If the rooster calls thrice before the mountain glows, it will rain by midday." Or, "Don't trust the morning if the crows beat the rooster." These weren't jokes. They were wisdoms wrapped in poetry, and they told people more than just the hour. They spoke of weather, of mood, of fate. And yes, they sometimes messed up. Roosters can crow at weird hours. Some just like to party at midnight. You've got one in your neighborhood now, don't you? The insomniac bird that seems to exist solely to torment tired humans. But in Joseon, Korea, if the rooster crowed too early, some villagers would light incense or offer small rice cakes at the door, just in case a spirit had tried sneaking in early. You know, just covering all the bases. Now, let's take one more step toward the truly charming. Rooster competitions. Yep, in certain regions, young men raised roosters not only to crow, but to crow the loudest and earliest. These champion cocks became little village celebrities. Some families even painted their combs with natural dyes, or fed them special diets of dried persimmons and barley. Not for fighting, this wasn't cockfighting, but for pride. The bird that greeted the sun first was considered lucky, and so was the household. And so the humble rooster became a status symbol, a weather forecaster, a guardian, and a spiritual clock. In many ways, it still is. Even today, in some rural parts of Korea, older generations speak fondly of the rooster hour. They say it like a blessing or a warning, as if the bird still has something important to say, as if time itself is feathered and waiting. So you, lying here in the soft hush of night, wrapped in your blankets with glowing numbers on your bedside table, maybe you feel far from that world. Maybe you don't think much of birds or statues or incense by the door, but somewhere inside you there's a rhythm that responds, a part of you that might still stir to the sound of a far-off crow, because time was once felt, not read. It lived in the sounds outside your door, in the rituals of dawn, in the silhouette of a wooden bird standing guard beneath the moon. And maybe, just maybe, part of you wishes it still did. You're still lying there, eyes fluttering slower now, breaths coming deeper. But don't drift off just yet, because as the rooster crows fade into the distance of your imagination, something far more mechanical takes its place. Tick, tock, clink, splash. It's the sound of water again, steady, soft, persistent, like time itself dribbling through unseen fingers. And tonight you're standing in front of a masterpiece of ancient engineering. No, not in a gilded museum or behind laser-protected glass. You're right in the middle of a workshop. The floor is cluttered with wooden planks, brass pipes, ceramic basins, and what looks like a very proud, very oily-faced man in robes squinting at a gear system. This is the lair of the late Joseon clockmaker, a curious hybrid of artisan, scientist, and slightly sleep-deprived magician. Now, most people think water clocks in Korea stopped evolving after King Sejong's self-striking model back in the 15th century. But surprise, the Joseon dynasty didn't just maintain them, they iterated on them again and again and again. These weren't museum pieces, they were in active use for hundreds of years. So let's take a gentle stroll forward in time. From Sejong's glowing golden age into the gritty, real-world practice of maintaining and modifying water clocks in Korea's later centuries. These weren't static inventions. They were living machines, subject to rust, weather, and human meddling. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the night. During the later Joseon period, many regional courts and city offices commissioned local versions of water clocks, some of which were simplified adaptations of Sejong's design, and others that took on entirely new shapes. What was once an elite, palace-only device began to trickle out into the hands of bureaucrats, scholars, and even temple monks. These clocks weren't always elaborate. In fact, some were downright humble. Ceramic basins fitted with bamboo pipes, ticking away in the background while the rest of life hummed on. And yes, we've got your quirky tidbit locked and loaded. Some later water clocks were designed to sing. Okay, not like Adele. More like wind chimes underwater. Inventive clockmakers in the 17th and 18th centuries began to include tiny tuned bells and hollow bamboo reeds that produce musical tones when triggered by floating devices. Think of it as a watery xylophone of time. Imagine this. At exactly the second watch of the night, just before dawn, the clock's float system lifts a tiny ball bearing, which drops onto a small bell tuned to a low, soothing tone. It echoes through the temple chamber where monks are meditating. The sound is soft, rounded, barely more than a whisper, but it signals transition from night to day, from silence to movement. A poetic tick. Now let's talk about the people behind these ticking wonders, because by the late Joseon era, clockmaking was no longer just a royal gig. It had become a respected craft in cities like Gongju, Jeonju, and Andong. These weren't massive industrial centers. They were sleepy cultural hubs where artisans passed down their secrets like heirlooms. Picture a young apprentice, fingers calloused from carving wooden gears, learning to balance a water vessel just right so the flow remains consistent. A hair too high, the float tips early; too low, it never triggers. These guys weren't just craftsmen, they were human metronomes, tuning their senses to the heartbeat of time. But even in the dusty glow of the workshop, things got complicated. Because, as you might have guessed, Korea wasn't building these clocks in a vacuum. By the 1600s, European mechanical clocks had begun to slip into Asia via trade, missionaries, and diplomats. These were shiny, complex, and very foreign, like showing up to a village soup competition with a microwave. And so the tension began. Historians still argue whether Korean scholars embraced or resisted Western timepieces. Some texts suggest they were fascinated studying the new clocks like alien technology. Others hint at cultural skepticism. If a Korean water clock had worked for generations, why trade it for some jangly European contraption that chimed too loudly and needed oiling every week? You can almost imagine the scene. An old Confucian scholar glaring at a Dutch-imported spring clock, muttering under his breath, "This thing sounds like it's being mugged by its own gears." Yet, curiosity won out. Hybrid clocks began to appear, merging traditional Korean mechanisms with European metalwork. Brass gears replaced wooden ones. Glass faces were added. But always, the heart of the machine remained water. Because water? was philosophical. It flowed, it adapted, it carried the weight of yin and yang. Water didn't just mark time, it reflected it. So in temples and libraries, in regional academies and magistrates' homes, you'd find these updated water clocks chugging away. Some still dropped pebbles, some rang bells, some just kept quietly filling bowls. And then there's the story of Master Yi Guan, a lesser-known artisan from the 18th century whose name shows up in faded ledger books and the occasional footnote. Yi Guan was known not for flashy designs, but for his clock repairs. He was the guy you summoned when the palace timekeepers started acting weird, too fast, too slow, dripping sideways. He'd arrive with a small cloth bundle of tools, bow politely, and then, get this, listen to the clock. He'd kneel next to the basin, press his ear to the ceramic shell, and simply listen. He said the water talked, that if you listened long enough, you could hear where the imbalance lay. People thought he was a little strange, but his clocks always worked again. That kind of instinct? You can't teach it. And yes, timekeeping at this point wasn't just for ceremony, it had political weight. Regional governors used clocks to standardize work schedules, temples used them to structure meditation, and schools used them to chime the start of lessons. This made the people who built, maintained, and repaired clocks quietly powerful. They weren't nobles or generals, but in a world that ran on rhythm, they were like orchestra conductors behind the curtain. Still, nothing lasts forever. By the mid to late 1800s, with Korea opening more rapidly to foreign influence and industrialization creeping in, the eras of water clocks faced its twilight. Factories in Japan and the West began mass-producing affordable mechanical clocks. Korean merchants bought them. Young officials preferred the crisp tick of a brass alarm over the gurgle of water in a clay pot. And so, piece by piece, the handmade clocks were tucked away. Some were donated to temples, some were dismantled for parts, some, heartbreakingly, just forgotten, but not all. A few survive today, in museums, yes, but also in dusty corners of heritage buildings and the memories of family lineages, in scholarly texts and whispered stories passed down in tea shops. If you look closely at some traditional Korean homes, especially those restored in folk villages, you might spot a ceramic basin with an oddly placed spout or a tiny bell hanging near the floor. Clues, echoes. And you? You now know what to look for. You know what it means to live by water, to wake with a rooster, to mark your life by floating pebbles and soft chimes. You felt the rhythm in your bones. You've walked the palace corridors, smelled the incense, squinted at blueprints by candlelight. You've traveled with time itself. So next time your alarm clock startles you awake with that harsh, jarring buzz, take a second. Imagine a quieter world, one where bells whispered, water flowed, and a carved wooden rooster kept the night at bay. That's where you've been tonight. The final stretch of your journey begins not with the tick of a clock or the crow of a rooster, but with something quieter, a space, a breath, an almost imperceptible pause in the march of time. You've seen the brilliant spark of invention, the careful maintenance of centuries-old timepieces, the water that dropped, struck, and sang. You've met kings, monks, engineers, and even that oddball Master Yi Guan who whispered to ceramic bowls. But now, you stand at a crossroads, the moment where tradition begins to flicker, not because it failed, but because the world around it began to spin faster. Tonight, you are in Seoul, but not the Seoul of palace guards and Confucian scholars. This is early 20th century Korea, under the gray shadow of colonization. The land is changing. Brick buildings rise where wooden hammocks once stood. Steam-powered machines clatter in workshops. Electricity hums like an unfamiliar tune, and the measurement of time, the heartbeat of your long, dreamy walk through history, is changing too. Your shoes click on cobblestones as you pass a newly built Western-style clock tower, glaring down like a steel sentinel over the market street. It's loud, mechanical, and ruthlessly precise. It chimes every hour on the hour, announcing itself with the confidence of an empire. But your ears, somehow, still crave that soft, echoing splash of water. Let's settle into this last chapter by looking at the slow, bittersweet farewell to Korea's ancient timekeeping traditions and the way modernity gradually dissolved them, not with a bang, but with a low, ticking murmur. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1910s, Western timekeeping had been largely standardized across Korea, especially in urban centers. Schools, factories, and public offices all ran on mechanical clocks, synchronized and mass-produced. Time was no longer a quiet whisper. It was a factory whistle, a school bell, a train schedule etched in stone. And yet, you're going to love this quirky tidbit. Some rural Korean villages kept using traditional water clocks into the 1930s, not as official timekeepers, but as ceremonial symbols. One documented example involved a monk at a remote mountain temple who used a pebble drop clock during night vigils, not to wake anyone, but to pace his meditation. Imagine that. While city trains thundered past somewhere in the forest, a single monk sat still, waiting for the plop of water into a bowl to mark his breath. This brings us to the core debate, one still alive in dusty conference rooms and old-school academic journals. Did Korea lose something vital when it let go of its water clocks? Or was it simply growing into a new skin? Historians still argue whether the shift to mechanical timekeeping erased cultural memory or preserved precision at the cost of beauty. After all, water clocks weren't just devices. They were philosophies. They taught patience, flow, harmony. When time dripped rather than ticked, it was easier to see it as something alive. But time waits for no one, especially not for philosophy. And so, ancient water clocks were boxed up, put in storage, sometimes displayed behind velvet ropes in museums. One of King Sejong's original Jeolleongnu pieces, a miraculous, self-striking marvel of brass and wood, now sits in the National Palace Museum of Korea, clean, polished, silent. You lean in to study its spout, the pathways carved into bronze, the tiny metal dragons poised to strike their bells. It doesn't move anymore, but you can feel the motion in your mind, water flowing through 100 invisible veins, orchestrating time like a ghostly symphony. And just when you're about to turn away, a museum worker, bored perhaps, presses a hidden button. For a moment, the clock whirs, a bell pings, a float lifts. It's artificial, sure, but your heart lifts a little. Outside, modern Korea buzzes like a neon-drenched beehive. Digital clocks blink on smartphones. Subway doors slide open to computer-chimed beeps. Even your favorite Korean dramas mark dramatic scenes with a suspenseful tick-tick-tick of countdown timers. But don't be fooled. Underneath all that technology, something ancient still pulses. In recent decades, there's been a slow but steady revival of cultural appreciation for Korea's water clocks. Artisans and historians have come together to reconstruct working models, not just for show, but to teach. Engineering students study hydraulic principles. Elementary school kids visit museums and build mini Jeolleongnas out of paper and tape. A few robotics clubs have even tried to combine modern sensors with ancient water pathways. Because why not? Time is a river, and rivers flow forward. You wander into one of these workshops, this time not in a palace, but a college lab, where a professor in sneakers and round glasses is showing students how to calibrate water flow using AI. The students laugh, tap their tablets, but when the bell rings, ping, they pause, just for a second, to feel it. So maybe the rooster statues are gone, maybe the bamboo pipes are cracked, but the soul of the water clock, it's still here. And here's something comforting to take with you into sleep. Even today, on special days in Seoul's Gwanghwamun Square, a full-size working replica of King Sejong's water clock is activated. People gather, kids gasp, elders nod slowly, and when the bell chimes, time doesn't just move forward, it folds. For one moment, past and present hold hands. As your eyes start to flutter again, I want you to remember this journey. You've moved through palaces and mountains, through silence and song, through copper basins and bronze dragons. You've seen what it means to measure time, not with pressure, but with patience. So yes, your phone might buzz at 7 a.m. sharp tomorrow. But somewhere in your memory, a tiny pebble will fall into a water bowl. A rooster will blink and flap its bronze wings. A float will rise, a bell will whisper. And you'll know, not just what time it is, but what time feels like. Now let's let that feeling carry us into the quiet. Let your shoulders soften now. Let your breath come slower, deeper. You've walked through 15 chapters of human rhythm tonight. And now we let go of clocks, bells, and dripping bowls. The night around you is still. Imagine yourself back in one of those old mountain temples far from the city lights. The only sound is the slow gurgle of a stream nearby and the rustle of bamboo leaves in the wind. You're lying on a simple mat. A clay basin nearby catches the moonlight. A single droplet of water falls, then another and another. They mark the passing of time not with urgency, but with grace. You feel safe here. The kind of safety that only comes when you realize that time isn't chasing you. It's flowing with you. It carries you forward, gently, like a leaf on a stream. There are no alarms in this place, no ticking clocks, just the quiet, breathing world and your soft presence within it. Whatever kind of day you had, let it fade now. You've done enough. You've learned, imagined, wandered through history, and now you're allowed to rest. Time will keep flowing. No need to hold it. Just let it trickle past like water. Your eyes are heavy. Your heartbeat has slowed. You're floating. Sleep is near. And time? Time is smiling.